Welcome back, folks. So the last thing we talked about in terms of brain development was the cerebral cortex and those lobes associated with it. So we talked about the specialized areas of the cortex, but oftentimes they actually involve interconnections with each other too. So yes, they have specializations, but that it's not always isolated. There's actually a lot of interconnections with each other. So I'll also say, unlike other species, the human cortex has large areas that are not pre-wired to respond to external stimulation in a specific way. So you can see that these different species here, these are brains of different species like a rat, a ground shrew, and other types of animals. You can see that they have different proportions of areas devoted to certain functions in their brains. They're very colorful brains because they associate with the colors here, which stand for different functions like motor, auditory, etc. But if you look at, you can look at these last two because again, we are related to chimpanzees. There is some white here too, but the human brain has a lot of white spots, right? And what the white spots represent is uncommitted cortex, as it says here in the key. So the white spots are uncommitted areas, meaning the human brain has lots of room for integrating information in various ways. There's not really necessarily a specific way that it's pre-wired to take in information. So this gives infants the capacity to develop brain circuits that grow and change depending on experiences that they have. This hopefully rings a bell of the term plasticity. We talked about that at the beginning of the semester. Plasticity is the degree that something can be malleable. In this case, it would be the brain. So we're going to talk about the role of experience in brain development. But before we do that, I'm going to show a short video that kind of shows a summary of all the technical things that we discussed in the last video in brain development, and also kind of segues us into this next portion where we discuss the role of experience. So I think it was a good kind of segue between the two. So let's watch this brief video and then continue on.
A child's experiences during the earliest years of life have a lasting impact on the architecture of the developing brain. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences shape the process that determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. During this important period of brain development, billions of brain cells called neurons send electrical signals to communicate with each other. These connections form circuits that become the basic foundation of brain architecture. Circuits and connections proliferate at a rapid pace and are reinforced through repeated use. Our experiences and environment dictate which circuits and connections get more use. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent. Meanwhile, connections that are used less fade away through a normal process called pruning. Well-used circuits create lightning-fast pathways for neural signals to travel across regions of the brain. Simple circuits form first, providing a foundation for more complex circuits to build on later. Through this process, neurons form strong circuits and connections for emotions, motor skills, behavioral control, logic, language, and memory during the early critical period of development. With repeated use, these circuits become more efficient and connect to other areas of the brain more rapidly. While they originate in specific areas of the brain, the circuits are interconnected. You can't have one type of skill without the others to support it. Like building a house, everything is connected, and what comes first forms a foundation for all that comes later.
Alrighty. So thank you for watching that. But as you can see, there's a lot happening in the brain during infancy. And there's a lot at stake, right? We can think of these early months and even early years of life as kind of a sensitive period for our building connections in the brain for certain things, which is accomplished through experiences. That's how we make those connections. So we're going to talk about experience and brain developments. So we are going to talk about two major classes of brain development: experience expectant, which is on this slide, and the next slide will be experience dependent, brain development. So experience-expectant brain development, what the heck does this mean? So this includes processes that anticipate or expect experiences that are universal in all normally developing members of the species. So we're pre-wired for these experiences. For example, the evolution of the visual cortex. The human brain expects to be exposed to visual images, like seeing patterns, seeing borders between light and dark. It's a part of being a human, right? And this prepares the baby for visual experiences to further develop their visual systems. Does that make sense? So it's things that we're pre-wired for based on human experiences. Another example would be the parts of the brain associated with language. This prepares the baby to process and learn language. Virtually all human environments are rich with language. So that's another example of something that's kind of universal to human experiences and human development. So experience-expectant processes have evolved to allow infants to take advantage of their exposure to these things that are expected in the human experience. So they eventually can develop basic human behaviors and abilities. That's really what this is getting at. So the idea is that infants are expected to be provided with the necessary environmental input to develop these neural connections that are pre-wired. But this is only if they are provided with an average normal human environment and human experience, right? One that is rich with language and rich with visual input, etc. So when expected experiences like this are lacking severely during these early months and early years, the brain might fail to develop normally. For example, babies that are severely deprived of human contact. If a baby is not getting any language input, for example, they can actually lose their ability to successfully process and use language altogether in their life. So that's what we mean by this is a very sensitive period for certain things, especially like language. So there's evidence for these experience-expectant processes and brain development in the form of patterns and synapses. So we're going to talk about synaptogenesis and synaptic pruning. These are kind of serving as evidence for these experience-expectant aspects of brain development. So at different points in development, including infancy, childhood, adolescence, different parts of the brain will start undergoing a very large increase in synapse formation. This is what we call exuberant synaptogenesis. So producing way more synapses that could ever be needed. And it's really preparing the brain for a range of possible experiences. We also have synaptic pruning. It's kind of an ebb and flow here. So synaptic pruning is kind of the idea that you use it or lose it. If the synapses are not being used and connections aren't being made due to lack of experiences, what happens is they die off or they're pruned. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. So just like pruning a plant is a necessary part of keeping it alive and growing efficiently, synaptic pruning keeps the brain efficient in its processing. And it's when severe deprivation of experience is occurring, that's when we can see maleffects in brain development. So there's synaptic pruning periods across development in infancy, childhood, and adolescence as well, just like periods of exuberant synaptogenesis. And as the video said earlier, experiences are key on building the brain's architecture, which leads us to experience-dependent brain development. So for going back to experience-expectant brain development, what happened was synapses are created in advance to reflect the experiences that are universal to humans, that are expected. Now for experience-dependent brain development, synapses are generated in response to specific unique experiences. That kind of makes sense, the differentiation there. So it has evolved to allow us to take advantage of new and changing information in our environment. Allows humans to learn from experience and not necessarily be limited by sensitive periods. So for example, like the image shows here, learning to drive. You can learn to drive at 16, at 25, 35 years old, and either way, you'll be able to learn. So there's not really a critical period where you must learn to drive during this time, otherwise you'll never be able to. Now this differs from language processing, right? Like we just talked about, where there are critical and sensitive periods, and you do need to be exposed to language input early in life, at least your primary language. That would be an example of experience-expectant language, but driving could be an example of experience-dependent brain development. Um, let's say you want to learn a second language. This is different, right? If you want to learn a second language down the road, that's different, kind of like the image here depicts that, but you already have your brain primed for language based on your first primary language at that point. So learning a second language would be more of an experience-dependent situation. Hopefully that makes sense. A famous study is by Mark Rosenzweig and colleagues. So in the 80s, there was lab rats that were used and they were provided different environments. So some of the rats had standard cages and they were provided food and water. So just the basics of life. Some of them had enriched conditions. And this included play items, formal training, running through mazes. They're placed in open fields with toys and enrichment. So the results were interesting. They showed that the enriched group exhibited superior development in a few ways. Their rates of learning were better. Their cerebral cortex weighed more. There's more synaptic connections. And this was replicated in numerous experiments. So in conclusion, the quality of the environment and experiences makes a difference in brain development. And this doesn't just apply to rats, it applies to human infants as well. So hopefully that helps us understand a little better about the role of experience in brain development. So thank you for joining everyone in this portion, and I'll see you in everything that might come next. Take care.